America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. And he's working on a new book, which will be out next year, I hope. So please join me in welcoming, in a time of great uncertainty and confusion, two people who actually know what's going on.
I know less and less each week. All right, great. This one. Is this working?
Push it up, the button all the way up. There it is. I can hear it track.
All right, excellent. Oh, terrific. So, delighted to be here. I suspect the war in Iran is in the front of everyone's mind, and I want to assure you I will say some words about it at the end. I'll get there by building a number of pieces of the puzzle together, but I'll save my specific remarks about that at the end. This is a young crowd, so you may not actually, some of you may not have heard what I'm about to start with, but years ago, Saturday Night Live had a little skit where one of the characters talked about something called the 10-minute university. I don't know if you remember this, but the 10-minute university was going to teach you in 10 minutes everything you'd remember about your college education 10 years after you graduated. So, economics, supply and demand. That's all you'd remember 10 years later. And in a sense, what I'm going to do today is teach you what you would have learned if you'd been an international relations major at a really good university, but would still maybe have a chance of remembering 10 years later. A few simple ideas. And the underlying text is these are simple ideas that people who run countries often forget about. Either they're unaware of them, they don't take them seriously enough, or they think that they are somehow magically an exception to them. And when they ignore them, they tend to get into trouble. As I said, I'll close with some comments on the situation with Iran. So let me start with the balance of power. The logic here is really quite straightforward. In a world of lots of separate states, each one worries that if one of them gets too strong, it might start using its power in dangerous ways. And they often respond by forming alliances or coalitions to try and keep those powerful states in check. That tendency gets stronger if a powerful state is nearby, you worry more about it. If it seems to have aggressive ambitions, you worry more about it, you try to take action against it. If it's building lots of military capabilities that are directly threatening to you as well. Pretty simple idea, and you can think of lots of examples through history of states coming together to balance a threatening power. Yet, interestingly enough, the people who run countries often forget about this. So, Henry Kissinger, right, when he was National Security Advisor, kept insisting that if we did right, what actually happened? We didn't win in Vietnam. NATO didn't fall apart. And in fact, the United States soon, under Kissinger's leadership, established a strategic relationship with China, a balancing relationship against the Soviet Union. He completely misunderstood how the balance of power really worked. Saddam Hussein, when he seizes Kuwait and suddenly discovers he's facing a vast coalition led by the United States to oppose him, a coalition that was vastly stronger than Iraq. George W. Bush invades Iraq and then discovers a year or two later that Iran and Syria are aiding the insurgents in Iraq. They are essentially trying to balance the United States as well, something the Bush administration didn't anticipate. Last example, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine and Finally, even the United States may not be immune to this tendency. We've been very fortunate. Countries generally don't form big coalitions against us. But if you remember the speech that Prime Minister Carney of Canada gave at Davos this year, he's basically saying medium powers have to start working together. Not so much to oppose the United States, but to insulate themselves from things that the United States might do. The lesson here is that being powerful and threatening usually gets you into more trouble because you're going to face growing opposition over time. So balance of power, there's one idea. Second idea is closely related to this idea of the security dilemma, and it basically says that the things one country might do to try and make itself feel safer, increasing its defense budget, maybe forming an alliance, often makes someone else feel less safe. And they react by trying to make themselves safe, which in turn makes the first state feel insecure again, and you get a spiral interacting back and forth where each side is feeling increasingly threatened. And it's a genuine dilemma because there's no obvious solution to the problem. There are ways of addressing it, but there's no obvious solution. So let me give you a great example. NATO insists that it is a purely defensive alliance and that it poses no threat to Russia. In fact, you can go on the NATO website, you can find a whole page explaining why this is the case. We're purely defensive alliance. But of course, that's not how it looks to Moscow. From their perspective, the world's most powerful military alliance has spent the last 25 years moving steadily closer to Russia. And then in 2008, the United States proposed issuing invitations to Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance, over the objections, I might add, of other NATO members who didn't think that was such a hot idea. All right, here's what the U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, said, writing back in 2008 from Moscow to Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. I have yet to find anyone, including Putin's sharpest liberal critics, who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. Right. Yet many in the West still think we did absolutely nothing, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine was completely unprovoked and is just a reflection of Putin's imperial dreams or innate Russian aggressiveness. It's entirely their fault, and we had nothing to do with it as well. But it's worse than that. Countries like Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and others want to be in NATO because they are worried about Russia. They have legitimate concerns, totally understandable. But of course, even the possibility that they might join made Russia's leaders feel less secure and eventually led Moscow to launch an illegal war. Essentially a preventive war in some respects. So here's the dilemma. Does that mean, well, to avoid this, you just accommodate any country that might have a grievance? You appease them? No, it really is a dilemma. States can't guarantee their security by unilaterally disarming. You can only try to manage this dilemma through intelligent diplomacy and by trying to understand how your actions might be unintentionally seen as threatening to others. And sometimes this works. And let me give you two examples of this. When Norway joined the NATO alliance in 1949, they were concerned that doing so would alarm the Soviet Union. They wanted to be in NATO, they wanted the protection, but they were worried that the Soviet Union might take action that would undermine Norwegian security. So they joined the alliance with a couple of reservations. Nuclear weapons could not be stationed on Norwegian territory, and there could be no permanent NATO military installations on Norwegian soil. And this was designed to accommodate what might have been Russian concerns about their own security, right, as part of Norway's decision. And this worked, right? The Russians grumbled a little bit, but they actually took no action to stop it, no action to intervene there. Second example, some of you will remember Anwar Sadat's famous visit to Jerusalem, right, where he gives a speech in the Egyptian parliament saying he's ready to go to the ends of the earth, right, in search of peace, including to the Knesset itself. right? And I think it's like 2 weeks later, he's there. He gets an invitation from Israel. He goes and gives a remarkable speech about how he acknowledges that Egypt and the other Arab states have done harmful things to Israel. Of course, Israel had done harmful things to them. He points that out too. But he repeatedly addresses all of the potential objections Israelis might have. You might think that I'm here just trying to lull you into a false sense of security. Let me explain to you why I'm not doing it. And it's also was credible. It worked because it was such a risky move for Sadat. In fact, he ultimately pays with his life for it. But Israelis could take it seriously because he wouldn't have taken a chance like this if he didn't really mean it. So you can sometimes address a security dilemma in that way as well. Third concept, nationalism. You all know what nationalism is. Nation is a group of people united by ethnicity, language, culture, common history, and by the collective sense that they constitute a unique community. And the doctrine of nationalism says that groups that form a nation should be able to govern themselves, should be politically independent. If you understand how powerful this is in the modern world, then you can understand why we no longer have big colonial empires. People in the colonies wanted to govern themselves. You can understand why opposition to immigration is rising in lots of places. People worry that somehow their cultural identity will be diluted. You can understand why Brexit happened, even though many people pointed out that the economic consequences were going to be quite severe as well. Yet time and again, leaders fail to appreciate just how powerful this force is. George W. Bush again assumes that Iraqis are going to greet us as liberators and that Afghans would welcome the NATO occupying forces. Some of them did, but not all of them. They didn't want to take orders from a bunch of foreigners occupying their country. Vladimir Putin, it seems to me, underestimated the ferocity of Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion, because Ukrainians had no desire to be subordinate to Moscow again. They tried that once, didn't enjoy it very much. Similarly, why is Prime Minister Carney Prime Minister of Canada now? Because yes, because the Conservative Party in Canada was 20 points ahead in the polls, and Trump started threatening Canada, and Trump started saying, maybe we should make it the 51st state. And the Conservative candidate was kind of a Trump-like candidate, and immediately the Carney campaign began running what was this, the famous Elbows Up campaign. There was a famous TV ad with Mike Myers, basically exploiting Canadian nationalism, which reacted very strongly and elected a liberal prime minister as well. You've seen this in some other countries as well. President Lula in Brazil has actually seen his popularity go up the more he defies whatever pressure the Trump administration has put on them, something, again, I don't think Trump anticipated as well. The point again, we may be seeing that now in the Iran case as well. All right, number 4, misperception. Countries put a lot of effort into trying to understand each other, trying to figure out what's going on in their heads, what are they trying to do, what are their aims, and they still don't do a very good job of it. And there's several reasons for it, and I'll try to cover this pretty quickly. One reason is that we don't actually, as humans, don't process information all that well. We don't update our beliefs quickly enough. So once we've formed an impression of another country or another leader, even if we get information that's contrary to that impression, we tend not to update fast enough. We don't readjust our thinking. So in 2002, 2003, before the Iraq War, we were convinced Saddam Hussein was a liar, that he cheated, he didn't ever tell the truth. So when Iraq is telling us we've gotten rid of all of our weapons of mass destruction, really, they were in fact telling us the truth, but we didn't believe it. There was lots of evidence that they were telling us the truth, but we didn't believe it as well. Second problem, this comes again out of social psychology. We tend to see our own behavior. What we do is determined by the circumstances that we're in. We're reacting to the situation we find ourselves in. We tend to assume that other people are just reacting the way they want to. Notice, their behaviors are a reflection of their character or their desires or their wishes. Our behavior is just what we're being forced to do by circumstances. Now, translate that into foreign policy. If we have a problem, it's your fault because you have latitude, you have agency, you're just doing what you want to do. I'm just doing what I have to do, what I'm forced to do by you. It's your fault, not mine. Of course, that's going to be going on both sides as well. States, again, misunderstanding each other as well. And then finally, there's this sort of classic problem. I think we're seeing this in spades now. Humans, we're social animals, and most of us actually like to get along, especially with our immediate associates as well. Facing pressure to conform, individuals may go along without expressing their reservations. This is known as groupthink, right? And unless you're a part of a decision-making group where dissent is actually openly encouraged, you try to encourage people to say what they really think, there's a tendency for decision-making groups to all agree or not share dissident views very well. Walter Lippmann put this very nicely, that when all think alike, no one thinks very much. And you therefore get decisions that in retrospect, you look back at how could they have thought that made sense? And sometimes the participants will say, well, I did have some doubts about it, but nobody else seemed to, so I didn't bring mine up. All right, classic problem. So these are all sort of elements of psychology. There's actually, I think, a bigger problem for why countries don't understand each other. And that's, every country has its own national story, its own narrative. It tells itself about the past, and these tend to be pretty self-serving. Americans, we like to think of the moon landing and victory in World War II and the Marshall Plan and all the great things this country has done, and there are plenty of them. And we don't like to think that hard about the less desirable, less admirable parts of our history as well. Vietnam, slavery, things like that. When two states that have very different beliefs about the past, their historical narratives are radically different, they may not understand why the other side is acting the way it is. Why what appears to be irrational or dangerous or hostile is merely a reflection of that they have a different version of past events. So when we think about Iran in the United States, we think about the Iranian Revolution, we think about the hostage crisis, we think about crowds chanting death to America. When Iranians think about it, they think about the 1953 coup where we overthrew the government. They think about the support that we gave to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. So they have a different version of the past. And it's not like our version's right and their version's wrong. Both versions have a degree of truth in them. But when the two societies then try to talk to each other or understand each other, we're starting from a very different evidentiary base. You could argue the same thing about the current war in Ukraine, that Russia claims with some validity that the United States promised at the end of the Cold War that we would not expand NATO beyond Germany. With some validity. The United States, U.S. officials, I actually have a nasty letter from James Baker disagreeing with something I'd written on this point. We claim that we made no such promise. And there's some basis for that too. We didn't ever put it in writing, and the Russians never asked us to put it in writing, which was a mistake on their part. So both sides have a version of events that's at least partially true. They think we broke a promise. We think we did no such thing, and that their objections to this are just self-serving propaganda. And the big lesson here is that people who run countries should always be asking themselves, do I really understand what they're doing? Is it possible that they don't understand what I'm saying? Even if I'm telling the truth and I'm being as clear as possible, is it possible that my message isn't being received properly? What can I do that might make it clear how I see the situation and why I'm doing what I'm doing? Last but not least, norms and institutions. World politics is a little different than domestic politics because there's no central authority to impose order, to maintain peace, to enforce an agreement there's no world government of any real power. It's not, however, a complete anarchy, a world with no rules. States, in fact, need lots and lots of rules, hundreds, thousands of rules to regulate all of the ways that we interact. Just think of international air travel. Planes cannot fly from country to country without lots of rules about how this is managed. For example, that English is the default language of air traffic control. Right? Now, you can think about it. A country could suddenly say, we no longer want to follow any of those rules. Right? We're going to use Urdu as the language of air traffic control in our country. What would happen? No airlines will fly to that country immediately because it wouldn't be safe. That's just one illustration. There are lots of rules regulating global trade, the movement of capital across borders, the way in which we allow travel to happen in other ways, passports and things like that. It's unavoidable. You need to have rules. Well, and yet people who run countries can make three possible mistakes in how they approach the rules that govern international politics. One is to exaggerate what these rules can do. To believe, for example, that the United Nations can stop major powers from doing what they want. Now it's asking too much of the institution. In fact, the United Nations was set up in such a way so that it couldn't do that because the major powers didn't want it to be that powerful. So that's one example. You could also make the opposite mistake. You could underestimate the benefits of a particular set of rules or institutions without appreciating how valuable they are. Give you one that's in the news today. There's been a pretty well-established norm for over a century against assassinating the leaders of other countries. Right? Go back 500 or 600 years ago, this was actually a pretty common practice. You wanted to solve a problem with the neighboring principality, maybe if you can take the prince out, you can solve your problem. There was no great stigma against it. But over time, a pretty powerful norm emerged so that countries didn't try to eliminate heads of state, not even in World War I or World War II. Right? The Allies never tried to kill Hitler. Germans did, but not the Allies. And over time, that norm is starting to erode. Right? There have been various examples in the past, and of course, most recently, the United States quite openly and deliberately killed the head of state in Iran. Right? So this norm is almost gone now, and I believe we may wake up in a world that we don't like as much. It actually looks more dangerous, in part because we've legitimated this tactic, and we won't be the only ones using it. And it won't just be people who might actually try to go after American leaders. You can imagine of the 192 or so states in the world, some of them may start trying to solve their problems in this way. And my sense is this is not necessarily a world we're going to enjoy as much. We didn't put as much weight on the value of that particular rule. Third problem is ignoring the reputational consequences of breaking the rules. We all know that states are going to, when they have to, violate agreements that they've made, tear up treaties that they've signed, etc. But if you do it too often, right, you lose trust. People will no longer want to make an agreement with you because they don't believe you're going to stick to it. And they might make an arrangement that's less favorable with some other country, but if they think that that other country is at least going to abide by the agreement, that might be preferable. So there are reputational consequences to violating rules too often that states can also suffer as well. So I want to address one final issue that leaders often forget, and that's that it's usually much easier to start a war than it is to end one. There are lots of examples of this. We just look at, say, the Napoleonic Wars, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, Iraq, Afghanistan, the current civil war in Sudan. In all of these cases, the people who started the wars thought they were going to be short, quick, easy, and cheap, and they were wrong. They ended up lasting far longer than these people thought. And by the way, even in the cases where they were successful, they ultimately proved to be victorious, the price was much higher than they expected at the very beginning. The question is why? Well, I've already mentioned some of the reasons why. Nationalism. It's hard to know in advance just how fiercely your opponent is going to fight. And the people who start wars usually underestimate it. They convince themselves that the opponent is weak, is irresolute, isn't really going to fight very hard. And that makes sense. If you knew in advance that an opponent was going to fight like tigers to defeat you, right, you might think twice about whether or not this is a good idea or not as well. Once a war is underway, the problem of sunk costs begins to enter in. Families who have loved lost ones don't want to hear that those sacrifices were in vain, so leaders may feel they have to fight on, or they may actually even have to increase their war aims to make the losses seem worth the gains as well, make these sacrifices worth something. Also, the people who start wars, once you've started to suffer consequences, aren't going to want to admit they made a mistake. They now have to keep fighting in order to achieve something that they can call victory and that actually looks like a convincing victory as well. Third thing, once a war begins, whatever the relationship was between the two sides before it began, it's going to get worse. The feelings of hatred, suspicion, lack of trust, desire for vengeance, all of those things are going to increase, which of course then makes it harder to actually end the war or negotiate peace settlement at the end. So, obvious case, whatever Russians and Ukrainians thought about each other before the war started, their attitudes are going to be much worse now. Their ability to trust the other to abide by a peace agreement, if we ever get one, is going to be much lower. In other words, the security dilemma gets worse the longer the states fight, the more each will want to achieve to try and be secure. The other thing that happens here, as the fighting continues, the temptation to escalate the conflict goes up. You don't want to lose, so we'll bring in new weapons. We'll develop new things. We'll hit a wider range of targets. We'll expand to other areas, geographic areas, and third parties may start getting involved in various ways, either to help one side or the other for defensive reasons, the way we're helping Ukraine or have been helping Ukraine, or they see an opportunity to make gains for themselves by backing one side or the other or getting involved. And as the number of countries involved increases, making peace is harder because now you have to satisfy more and more parties. It may have started with, state A and state B, but if states C, D, E, and F have gotten involved, the peace settlement becomes even more difficult to reach. And last but not least, I talked about misperception. Oddly enough, you would think in a war is when you really want to be clear-eyed. You want to calculate very carefully. You want the best possible information because the stakes are so high. But it turns out the fog of war actually gets thicker as the fighting proceeds. Both sides, there's censorship, right? It gets imposed. Propaganda gets issued by governments. Leaders will keep announcing that they're winning in various ways. Anybody who questions the war effort or proposes peace talks may get denounced as a traitor. People inside the government who think it's a bad idea get forced out as well, so it's only loyal supporters of the war who stay in there. Military commanders, even if they oppose the initial decision to go to war, aren't going to want to stop until they've actually achieved a victory, because who wants to be a military commander who lost a war as well? What I'm suggesting here is that the problem of misperception actually gets worse the longer a war goes on. My favorite quotation of this is from Prime Minister Lloyd George of England during World War I, who said to an aide in 1916, if the people knew what was going on over in Europe, this war would end tomorrow. But of course, they didn't have an accurate picture of what was going on, and the war continued for another 2 years. So for all of these reasons, and there are probably a few others as well, most wars actually turn out to be harder to end than the people who start them expect at the beginning. That's not a statement that you should never fight a war, but that is a statement, it seems to me, that you should always do it. You go into this with only in the direst of circumstances when it's absolutely necessary. Now, what about today? And this will bring me to our situation in the Middle East. I think if you considered all those things I just talked about, Donald Trump is violating all of them, right? And when I wrote the conclusion of this book, I said, except he seems to understand that wars are a bad thing to start, right? And I wrote that a couple of months ago, and I have to go back and revise that section. The United States, in my view, and I wrote an article that was published a few weeks ago, we're acting like a predatory hegemon, right? A dominant power using threats of punishment to extract concessions not just from adversaries, but also from allies, from everyone at once. We're acting like a bully, and we're encouraging other states, therefore, to distance themselves, and in some cases to join forces to try and keep us in check or impose costs. And this is a radical departure for the United States. In the past, we have occasionally done really stupid things. We've acted in a predatory fashion towards countries that were our enemies, that we decided were our enemies, but we didn't act that way very often, and never in extreme form towards our friends, towards the Canadas, the Western Europes, the Denmarks, the Asian partners that we've had. And this is new. This is, I think, unique to this administration. Second, they're not showing much awareness of the security dilemma, that other states' reactions are a response in part to what we are doing as well. Many people in the United States believe Iran hates us for no reason whatsoever, even though the United States has repeatedly rejected Iranian efforts to improve the relationship, and we've inflicted great harm on them, far more harm on them over time than they have inflicted on us. And that's not a defense, by the way, of either the clerical regime or some of the things it has done. It's just to say that we may have had something to do with some of the things we don't like. I think this is an administration, as I said before, that doesn't appreciate the power of nationalism, which is why they're surprised every time a country stands up to them, or resists efforts at coercion, as Iran is doing now. And of course, it is a decision-making team of like-minded loyalists where all really does think alike, and no one's thinking very much. Last but not least, very important, a total disregard for rules and norms and agreements, both at home and abroad, right? And I think that's actually a consistent feature of President Trump, even as in his business career. Just not a guy who likes rules very much. So you put all this together, and it explains, or at least help us understand, why the United States has once again entered a war that will be harder to end than it was to start. Iran is not caving, and Iran has every incentive not to do it, to make us pay as big a price as possible. They have to prove that to us that we can't coerce them. There are limits to how much we can pressure them. They, in effect, are trying to restore deterrence, something you often hear American policymakers talk about. We had to do this to restore deterrence. What the Iranians are trying to do is restore deterrence, remind us that when we come after them, they can come after us and make us or our partners pay a significant price as well. And by the way, if you were an Iranian, why cut a deal with the United States at all? We had a deal back in 2015. And it was the United States that tore up the nuclear deal before. In fact, the late Ayatollah Khamenei, when asked once why he was no longer interested in negotiating with the United States, he responded to the interviewer saying, it's very simple, experience. Right. So the war is now expanding horizontally, as wars tend to do. We attack Iran. Iran has responded by attacking a bunch of our friends in the region as well, to get them to be upset with the United States and to put pressure on us to end it. And of course, Iranian nationalism is now at play as well. We've killed the supreme leader, which is upsetting not every Iranian, but some. We've been destroying some of their cultural sites as well. There was an article in the New York Times today about how this is triggering Iranian nationalism. And of course, when you kill innocent civilians, it tends not to immediately make the rest of the population happy about the country that's doing it. All right. And finally, last but not least, in this case, we started it. right? We can't even claim that we were provoked by a particular Iranian action as well. We are violating the norm against assassination, as I said, setting a dangerous precedent. And what's perhaps most worrisome is at this point, we don't have a lot of good options in front of us. We can double down and continue things. I don't know what your 401k looked like today, but mine's not quite as good as it was. Or we can admit that it didn't work, which is also not a particularly attractive outcome here. So let me just remind you of something that Winston Churchill wrote. And he was not a dove by any means. But he once wrote something that Trump should have paid attention to. This is what he said: "Never, never, never believe any war will be smooth and easy, or that anyone who embarks on that strange voyage can measure the tides and hurricanes he will encounter. The statesman who yields to war fever must realize that once the signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events." That is not an argument for never using force, for never going to war at all. It's an argument for being extremely careful and trying to do as good a job as possible of anticipating all of the things that might go wrong. So let me just sum this up very quickly, and then we'll have time for lots of questions, I hope. My contention is that if leaders of more countries, not just the United States, took these ideas more seriously, kept them in mind, they would make fewer costly blunders, and the world would be somewhat more peaceful. They would still make some mistakes, and there would still be lots of trouble in the world, but it'd be marginally, maybe even more than marginally better. If leaders understood the balance of power, they'd recognize the risks of excessive ambition, and especially acts of aggression. If they understood the security dilemma, they'd look for ways to make themselves secure without threatening others unnecessarily. If they understood the power of nationalism, they'd go to great lengths not to provoke a foreign population or occupy a foreign country. If they understood the many ways that states misunderstand each other, they might do a better job or work harder at explaining the reasons behind their actions in ways that others might be able to understand. If more leaders understood what global institutions were good for, but also what their limits were, and understood that breaking the rules has costs, they might do a better job of designing agreements that all countries would abide by. These, again, to repeat, is not a formula for perpetual peace. It's some guidelines that could give us a somewhat more peaceful world. If more world leaders understood them, didn't forget them, and didn't think they were an exception, given the current state of the world, I would settle for something better, even if it's less than perfection. Thanks very much. I look forward to questions. This gentleman here has the fastest hand in the room.
So I'm going to ask a couple, and then I'll open it up to you guys. Steve, thanks for that engrossing sprint through both international relations theory and the state of the world today. Let me start with where you more or less ended. The $1 trillion question: how do you think this ends in the Gulf?
I actually think it'll end by... Oh, sorry. I believe it will end with the United States declaring victory and ending and stopping it. And one of the interesting things that the administration has been criticized for is that not stating clearly what the objective was. And there have been about 15 different objectives that have been laid out as possibilities here. We're trying to obliterate their nuclear program, which we obliterated last summer. That the objective was to get rid of the supreme leader, that the objective was to remove Iran's support for Hezbollah and others once and for all. There are a whole series of different possibilities. And the advantage from the president's point of view of putting out a bunch of different possibilities is if at some point you decide you want to end it, you say, well, this was my real goal, we've achieved it, whatever thing you can point to, and that's it, we're done. So I think that's how this ends. But again, the other side gets a vote here too. And so we can say we're going to stop military operations, but Iran might continue in some ways to remind everybody that they have these capabilities. I don't think they want to go on much longer, but they do want to send a message to us and especially to the rest of the countries in the Gulf, because the next time the United States or Israel's contemplating something like this, they want to be able to call up and say, remember what happened last time? Right? And again, they're not happy with what Iran is doing, but they're also not happy that we got them into this position without having thought very long and hard about what the consequences would be. One last point here. I mean, I think one doesn't want to lose sight of the broader implications here. This was a decision that we made, and I think it looks to lots of countries around the world like we simply didn't care what the effects might be on the rest of the world. The United States was not going to get attacked by Iran, right? They don't have weapons that can reach the United States, but countries close to Iran can get attacked, right? The United States is an oil exporter. This affects the price of gas, as we're already seeing, but other countries that are more dependent on energy exports are really being affected, countries in Asia and elsewhere as well. And if I were in any of those countries, I would be saying, the United States doesn't seem to care about how this affects us. It's indifferent to our concerns. Maybe we need to rethink our relationship with the United States, at least in some ways. And that's, I think, long-term consequences here.
Do you think that, to follow up on that, do you think that and broader dysfunction in U.S. foreign policy, do you think that has any meaningful effect on big powers in Asia, on the Japanese, on the Australians, and other countries that are looking at the Chinese with one eye, but then also looking at events like what happened in the Gulf in the direction of U.S. foreign policy and reorienting on the Western Hemisphere?
So trying to organize serious opposition to the United States is really hard to do for several reasons. One, we are, in fact, a long way away from most of the world, and therefore most countries around the world are worried more about problems closer to home. And for that, we're actually a useful ally. Right? That's why countries in Asia have wanted to be our partners for a long time. But we have to do a lot to provoke serious opposition in other parts of the world. There's also a big collective action problem because the United States is so much bigger than everybody else is. So organizing combined opposition to the United States is really tough. You've got to get lots of countries to line up, and that gives any American government lots of ways to play divide and conquer and say, oh, we'll offer you a special deal. Don't join forces with them. So you really have to work hard to generate a lot of opposition, particularly among countries that we've had long-time partnerships with that still have close economic ties with the United States that they don't want to lose, that still hope to get some kind of security protection. So I am not predicting or wouldn't expect people reacting by, oh, we're going to form a big anti-American version of NATO and contain the United States the way we tried to contain the Soviet Union and did so pretty successfully. I don't think that's going to happen. What's going to happen instead is other countries are going to start de-risking. They will diversify their economic ties to the extent that they can. That is already underway. They are going to be less willing to make adjustments in their policies because we request that they do, less willing to compromise. They will, in some cases, I believe, want to distance themselves a little bit. The United States is doing this, but we aren't involved. Didn't use our territory, didn't help as well. So over time, America's ability to get cooperation from others will erode. Our ability to do business with some parts of the world will decline somewhat, not disappear, etc. And I've sometimes said that this could be a little bit like, the famous Hemingway definition of bankruptcy. How did I go bankrupt? Gradually, then suddenly. Right? That American influence and power in the world will not disappear immediately, but it will erode gradually, and there will be a point at which we sort of wake up and say, boy, we're just nowhere near the position of geopolitical influence that we had, say, for most of my lifetime. That's what worries me most right now.
In that same vein, how do you view how countries in the Southern Hemisphere are going to react in our hemisphere? Are they apt, and painting with a really broad brush here, do you think they're apt to sort of accept a more vertical and U.S.-driven order that's sometimes enforced with force or threats of force, or are they increasingly going to turn even more economically towards China and look for other alternatives?
Well, there's no question that much of Latin America now has pretty extensive economic ties with China and they want to continue them for purely economic reasons. It's beneficial for them in lots of different ways. And if you read the U.S. national security strategy that came out a month or two ago, it actually suggests that one of our objectives in dealing with Latin America is to persuade those countries to sever their economic ties. So we're essentially saying, not only can you not have, say, Chinese military bases or things like that, and China doesn't have any and doesn't seem to be wanting to get any right now, but we don't want you having Chinese companies invest in your economy. We don't want you to trade with China, etc. And notice what we're basically saying to these countries is, you have to stop doing this, even if it's good for you. And that means we're now responsible for the economic health of these countries, right? So if we are able to persuade them or coerce them into doing this and then their economies tank, they blame us as well. So I think this is not likely to work. There's a nice op-ed, actually, in today's New York Times by Osvaldo Stunkel, who's a very smart Brazilian political scientist, saying that Latin American countries are actually extremely good at nodding and telling Washington what it wants to hear, and then getting the next pile of investment from China or sending the next set of exports off to the Chinese market. And I think we'll see a lot of that. And in fact, we will see that in lots of other contexts as well. When you're acting like a predatory hegemon, the other thing weaker states do is they promise to do something and then they renege, or they shirk, or they drag their feet, or they delay. There's 192 countries out there. Keeping track of what all of them are doing is really difficult work. Just to illustrate this, so some Asian countries, South Korea and Japan both, in order to deal with the tariff problem, they agreed to invest in the American economy. I think the Japanese promised, several $100 billion of investment in American companies. Not if they wanted, this is not something they wanted to do. If they wanted to do it, they would just have done it, right? If it seemed like they did this to sort of buy off the Trump administration. But they didn't just write a check and hand it over, right? This is a pledge of investment that will take place over 5 to 10 years. And I'd be willing to take a bet that, if we come back in 10 years, a lot of those investments ultimately didn't get made because they were dragged out in various ways. Things change. So countries that are being pressured often get very creative about how to say yes now and say no later. If any of you have ever raised children, you know what this problem is like.
So let me open it up here. For those watching at home, if you go to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire website, and there should be a button there for the Slido app to submit questions. So, sir?
The question of starting war is easier. I look at it, there's actually three parties. Iraq, the United States, and Israel. Israel doesn't seem to want to stop the war as quickly as Trump might want to stop the war. So what are the dynamics? Trump wants to stop the war, comes up with some excuse and say, I achieved the 16 objective. But Israel said, no, we want to do this. And then Iran is saying, well, okay, it may be in our best interest to continue this war. Maybe not here, but we have lots of influence with terrorist cells around the world that can inflict a lot of pain on our interests. How do you see that dynamic?
Let me just summarize for the folks at home. Gentleman's question was about there being three parties to the war, the U.S., Iran, and Israel. And if the U.S. decides to declare victory and go home, do the Israelis keep fighting? And is there Iranian-Israeli confrontation, either directly or intermittently or through other proxies?
So I'd say several things. First of all, one does have to understand that this war ultimately began in part because the Israelis said that they were going to go attack Iran again. And at least according to Secretary of State Rubio, we decided to join in because we felt we had to back the Israelis if they were going to do it. This is the first time this has happened in a long time where we actively are participating in another country's war at their initiative. Now, then the question becomes, well, what happens if the interests begin to diverge? We want to end it, and the Israelis want to continue it. We have the ability to stop the Israelis by basically saying, well, you're not going to do it with our weapons anymore. We're not going to send you any more bombs, any more missiles, whatever. And if we're really unhappy with you, there's lots of other ways we could put pressure on you as well. But no American president, going back to John F. Kennedy, has been willing to do that. Right, and there was some speculation early on that Trump would be like the first American president who would because he didn't care, didn't have a strong, he wasn't like Joe Biden who had this deep emotional attachment to Israel, or claimed to as well, that maybe he would be different, and that's proven not to be the case. Right, if you look at the people he's appointed, the donors he's gotten money from at various points, the various policies he's adopted both in the first term and the second term, he appears just as if I don't know if I want to say beholden, but just as unwilling to put real pressure on it. Now, I do think Trump is a very self-interested person, and if he really thought his political fortunes were going to be ruined by allowing this to continue, he would try to put an end to it. The other thing to remember here is that Israel's getting damaged too, and information on exactly what's happening inside Israel is hard to come by. They've censored a lot of things coming out of there as well. But it's possible that actually the Netanyahu government will decide that enough is enough at some point, and maybe go back and do it again. I do think their objectives here, though, is essentially, and some Israeli officials have effectively said this, they want to do so much damage to Iran that it is never a problem for them again. And I think that's impossible.
Yes.
Is now the time for China to invade Taiwan?
Question is now the time for China to invade Taiwan?
Yeah, I was talking to one of my students about this very question this morning. I don't think so, because it's not something that the Chinese can generate overnight. I mean, that's a very intricate, difficult, demanding military operation that would require a lot of prior preparation, including the assembling the fleet that you'd have to put together, the troops, etc. And that's not something they could pull off immediately. So I'm not worried that I'm going to wake up next week and here comes the invasion. And also, as some of you may know, the Chinese military has been going through a real internal personnel turmoil with Xi Jinping removing a lot of top generals, etc. So they're probably not in an ideal position from a purely command point of view to do it right now. But the larger concern is that we are drawing down a lot of our own weapon stockpiles, right? And given the production rates of things like Patriots and others, which is very slow, it's going to take years to rebuild them, right? Moreover, we have, I think, how many carrier battle groups now in the Gulf region? At least 3, right? And nothing maybe in Asia. And one of those carriers is about to break the record for the longest deployment, uninterrupted deployment since Vietnam, since the Vietnam War, right? And these are machines that wear out, that have to go back into the yard, have to be refit. That takes months, if not years, to do it. So the American military is going to be tired, right? Both the personnel, but also the machinery, and somewhat depleted, and that's not something you can restore in a month or 6 weeks or whatever. So 2027, we're not going to be as capable a force as we would have been, even if the war ends tomorrow, just because it'll take a while to recover from that. And if that was the time that China decided, if not to actually, bolt from the blue invasion, I don't think that's going to happen, but start putting real pressure on Taiwan, maybe start trying to restrict trade, thinking about a blockade. Because after all, we've legitimated blockading other countries, right? We've said that's okay to do because we've done it in various places. Last time I looked, we still are blowing up boats in the Caribbean and Pacific just because we think they might be smuggling drugs, etc. So if China were to do something like that, we're not going to be in as favorable a position to respond as we might have been otherwise. And then last but not least, just the question you might want to ponder. our position in Asia is dependent upon allies. We are not an Asian country. We are over here, and Asia is a long way away. So we depend upon having close partnerships with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others. It seems to me the events of the last year have done two things. They've given them reason to question our judgment, but we've also given these countries reason to question just the consistency of our policies. On the one hand, we want these countries to spend more on defense because we want them to contribute to trying to balance China. That makes perfect sense as far as I'm concerned. But if that's what you want to do, you don't want to do things that hurt those countries' economies, which makes it harder for them to spend more on defense. Same true, by the way, is true with respect to Europe. We want Europe to spend a lot more on defense so we don't have to defend Europe. But if you're doing that, you don't want to keep threatening these countries with tariffs and other economic disruptions, which makes it harder for them to invest in defense. So the strategy doesn't make any coherent sense, and I do worry that countries in Asia who really would like to be partners with us, really want to work closely with the United States, are finding it extremely difficult to do. And that's not helpful if you're trying to deter China as well.
Time for just two more, sir.
Yes, just a genie out of the bottle in terms of international norms of behavior regarding kidnapping of the government and now this assassination in Europe. In the post-Trump world, how does the next administration reestablish that, or is that a lost cause?
The question was international norms with Maduro's kidnapping and Khamenei's assassination. Does the administration after Trump reestablish those norms, or are those broken?
Well, norms are human creations, rules that we've invented and adhered by, and you can always repair them in various ways. I want to broaden the question a little bit to the more broader question of how do you reassert or reestablish trust, right? And again, this is international politics. It has a nasty side to it. No country is always trustworthy. States will break rules at various times when they think they really have to. But having a reputation for not doing it very often and only doing it under real necessity is a good thing. So the question is, how would you restore this? And this is going to be much harder to do in 2028, regardless of who the next president is, than it was in 2020. In 2020, when Joe Biden was elected, not only was he a very familiar figure around the world, but the rest of the world could sort of say to itself, okay, the United States did this odd thing. They did this funny thing. They elected a guy named Trump president, but they've learned their lesson. They'll never do that again, right? And I believe that was very much the sense. And Biden came in and said, I want to work with partners. I'm familiar. You've known me for years, et cetera. And that worked really well. But of course, then we went and did it again in 2024. So other countries now have to wonder about the pendulum just swinging back and forth. Sometimes we get some reasonable people we think we can work with. Sometimes we get something else. And that's going to be much harder to do. And here's the scary part. One of the ways you could, in theory, reestablish better relations with the rest of the world post-Trump is by holding people in the Trump administration strictly accountable for breaking the law. Not for policy disagreements, things they did that you might disagree with. That's okay, that's politics. But criminal acts actually do something we hardly ever do in this country, which is holding high officials responsible for breaking the law. You could do that. And that would be a way of signaling to the rest of the world, look, we really do think this was bad and we want to hold these people accountable. That's how we're, first of all, reestablishing some norms here in our country, but reminding the rest of the world that we have some standards here. It's not just, get out of jail free card no matter what you do. All right? It would have been nice if we'd done that with some other people. By the way, both parties. I'm being bipartisan here. There are people I would have sent to jail in both parties. The difficulty is, the more clear you make it that that's what you're going to do in 2029, the greater incentive you give the current incumbents to stay in power forever. Because they don't want to face the possibility of criminal action. It's the same position that lots of other autocrats have found themselves in, or would-be autocrats, that they can't leave office because that's personally risky. Netanyahu's one, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, etc. This is the sort of standard problem. So not clear you want to announce that that's what you're going to do in advance, because it just gives the incumbents an incentive to hang on to power by any means necessary. Sleep well tonight.
Sir in the back, second in the back there, seated.
Yeah, so my question is, sounds maybe a little naive now, but after you summarize every rule that this current administration is not adhering to, what would you explain to somebody from abroad, for example? What's motivating them? What's the motivation of our current administration in your
Is it whatever Trump thinks of sitting on the toilet with his phone?
Question is, what is motivating the current administration?
Is it really that? I mean, is it really
It's
that?
obviously that.
That's what I'm trying to see. But it's obviously, to me, when you read the news, you would come to that conclusion. But from your standpoint as a political analyst, so what would you say? Because it's scary if this is true. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but it's so shockingly different that I just wonder if there is anything else maybe.
So first of all, there are different views actually within the administration on foreign policy, different schools of thought, different emphasis. The president is clearly driving the train, and there's not real opposition. His decision, I think, are the critical ones in lots of ways, but there are different objectives depending on who you're talking to in the administration. Just sort of be aware of that. But I do think it's motivated very much by a sincere, I think mistaken, but sincere set of beliefs that America's relations with the rest of the world are foolish, bad. The rest of the world's been taking advantage of us, ripping us off, to quote the president, stealing us, and we've got to reverse that. And furthermore, a lot of the policies we've adopted in the past, encouraging greater openness, encouraging people to come to the United States, etc., that's just let all the wrong people in and are slowly diluting it. There's the attack on Europe as a representative of wokeness and that they're facing cultural extinction, right, because they've allowed too many people who aren't Europeans and Christians and all that stuff into their society. But deep down, it's almost a set of grievance that we've somehow allowed all these other weak countries to take advantage of us, and we're going to take advantage of them now. That's part of it. I think the president has a worldview across the board. All human relations are basically between strong and weak, winners and losers, and if you're the strong, you impose your will upon the weak. If you're the weak, you accept it, because you have no choice. It's very much transactional. I can make an agreement tomorrow and I can break it the following day if it's to my advantage to do it. No concern about long-term reputation. You'd think he would have learned better, because one of the reasons he had to go into reality TV is he couldn't get people to loan him money anymore because he would never pay them back. And eventually he got a reputation for being a bad risk, so he had to find an alternative line of work, and that didn't penetrate. No, I just got away with it. Look, I got a new career, and now I'm president. And then finally, I think part of what's driving it is the sense that they don't think the rest of the world can really stand up to us. Right? That at the end of the day, we're omnipotent. You'll never find serious opposition. And I think that they're now maybe discovering that even a relatively weak country, and compared to the United States, Iran is not a powerful country, but even a relatively weak country can pose a surprising set of problems, right, for the United States. And maybe we're not quite as omnipotent as Trump liked to think. But I share your bafflement occasionally that I have trouble finding the sort of coherent logic to all of it. There's one final part of this, though, and this is the part that's, I think, individual with the president, that he is a narcissist, and ultimately it's all about him. It has to, and he is absolutely brilliant at keeping attention riveted on him. Everything. Put his name on everything, put his picture on everything. The tariff policy, the one the Supreme Court struck down, was wonderful because in order to know what the tariff was, you had to sort of call up the White House and ask the president, is it 12% today? Is it 43%? If he announced it was going up, he got headlines. If he announced it was going down, he got headlines. He's always got the headlines. One of my colleagues put it that the president is like a laser pointer on a screen, and we are just following it. We're like, it's quite remarkable, and it's part of the governing strategy. What they call flooding the zone. That I'm going to do something outrageous every week because by the time you've taken aboard what I just did, you'll have forgotten about what I did 3 weeks ago. Right? And then there's the Epstein files.
I think we got time for just two more.
I'll try to be short.
Thank you very much, both of you. It was absolutely fascinating. So, as you know, with the current reporting about what's going on in Iran, it's been reported that Steve Witkoff has made 2 tries for a ceasefire. Both of those times have been rebuffed by Iran recently. So, if Trump continues to come out as recently as yesterday and say, I can end the war whenever I want to end the war. So, what's your take on that? How long do you think he can continue with the lies about that? Or how is that serving him? And again, you have an idea about how it's going to end, so that's what I dare.
The question is about reporting about Steve Witkoff's attempts to create a ceasefire or truce with Iran and where that's going to go and how Trump uses that.
As you might expect, I do not have a high regard for Witkoff's skills as a diplomat. So I have no idea what credence to place on that. I mean, again, it is sort of a little bit odd that you would pick a real estate lawyer with no diplomatic experience to deal with the Middle East and the Ukraine war simultaneously, along with your son-in-law. It's sort of if you wrote it as a script, for a Hollywood movie, people would say, rewrite, make it more believable. All right. But it also, assuming that we have tried to explore that possibility and the Iranians have rejected it, it tells you that, first of all, they don't think they're losing, and that they really do understand that they have a strategic interest in making us pay a sufficient price so we won't do this again. All right. And that means maybe keeping it going for a while until they feel like they're not, they've made their point, et cetera, and then they're willing to settle. At what point does the president decide this is not worth continuing? I mean, he said 2 days ago or 3 days ago that he was demanding unconditional surrender, and then the White House spokeswoman said, the president will determine when they have unconditionally surrendered. Which, it's sort of, again, this is not the way normal statecraft gets done. But, the Dow hit 50,000 a few weeks ago. It's 46,000 now. In the past, that has been the kind of thing that has gotten the president's attention. Gas prices are going up, unlikely to go back down in a while. This is going to affect the price of fertilizer, and we're getting into crop season, et cetera. So you can imagine the economic repercussions starting to pile up as well. And there is an election coming up in the fall. So and unfortunately, and this is where my crystal ball gets really cloudy, on the one hand, that's an argument to declare victory and put an end to it. On the other hand, that's no, now I really have to show what I've achieved. I've got to do something more. And this is how wars continue, right? That, okay, I've got to get the Strait of Hormuz open again. In order to do that, I'm not going to invade Iran. I'm just going to send the Marines to occupy the coastline by the Strait of Hormuz to prevent them from attacking ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So I'll occupy just a small force going in there, et cetera. And I don't think that's going to happen, but you can understand that's how the logic of things ratcheting ever upward.
And to close us out, sir, and back.
Yeah, it seems to me one of the major negative consequences the United States might suffer of having such a dysfunctional government and dysfunctional foreign policy at this time is if the US dollar stops being the world's reserve currency. That people say, look at this country, they elected this idiot twice. Why don't we shift to a currency like the euro, start selling off our treasury bonds and investing in euros where monetary policy is much more insulated from popular politics?
Yeah.
Is that a real threat, do you see?
The question was the threat to the dollar as reserve currency by mercurial and predatory U.S. behavior. How real is that possibility?
I actually think it's relatively low risk. That there's not going to be a giant run on the dollar, and the main reason is that there is no alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency right now. The euro, there isn't enough of them. Their liquidity isn't deep enough. The renminbi is not convertible on international markets. It's still controlled, essentially. It's valued by the Chinese government. So the dollar is going to be the world's reserve currency for another N years, and I don't know how many that is, but a long time. But, so that's answer number one. But we are seeing, again, a gradual movement away from it.
Selling treasury bonds.
Yeah, no, exactly. So traditionally, going back decades, when bad things happened in the world, investors bought T-bills because T-bills were considered like the safest place to put your money, right? And for a variety of reasons, some of the ones you mentioned, some of the others, sort of long-term concerns about the deficit, things like that, people no longer regard T-bills as quite the safe haven they once were. It's not like people are suddenly selling them off wildly, right? But if you look at holdings of T-bills and what's happened to price in this latest crisis, it's not been like past ones. So what I want to say is, again, it's this sort of gradually then suddenly problem. You're seeing people moving gradually away from the dollar, wanting to invest in other things. Other foreign stock exchanges have performed better than the U.S. economy, in part, yeah. No, now we'll see what happens.
Currency has gotten stronger.
Right, right. So dollar has gone down in value. Other markets have gone up as well, et cetera. But again, it's not like a complete revolution or something like that. It's not like the European markets have gone up 50% and ours has gone down 30% or something like that. It's that ours for the last year has grown. Theirs just has grown faster. And some of that reflects misgivings. But so far, we haven't seen the sort of precipitous decline, and I don't think we're likely to. And again, because I should have hastened to add, I am not an economist. I hang out with a lot of economists, and I listen to what they say, and I have taken economics courses, it says, so I'm not completely ignorant. But I think the basic question is, no, the dollar as the world's reserve currency is not going to disappear overnight or even anytime soon, but its role and importance is eroding gradually. And if China were to change its policies towards the renminbi, which it probably won't do, but if it were to, it would become an attractive international currency for international transactions and as a store of value and things, all the things the dollar has been doing for a long time. But I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that the world is stuck with the dollar for a while to come, even though states are trying to reduce their vulnerability on that front.
The world is stuck with us more broadly. So, on that, Steve, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us and for a great evening. Really appreciate it. If we can give him a warm round of applause and see everybody downstairs.